Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. Russia has announced plans for a $628 billion military program, heavy on hardware, to re-equip the country's forces, which are now a shadow of their former selves. The UK military too is going through a far-reaching restructuring after a defence review which will see thousands of jobs and 8% of the UK's defence budget slashed by 2015. The US is reorganising its forces in favour of lighter units capable of deploying rapidly anywhere in the world, with an emphasis on technology. And of course, China is rapidly rising up the ranks of military strength, spending more and more each year. But does this emphasis on who's spending what miss a bigger point? How do the big spenders see the world developing? Where do they see future threats coming from? And who are they gearing up to protect themselves from? To discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio in London by Dr. Julian Richards. He's co-director of the Centre for Security and Intelligence Studies at the University of Buckingham. Dr. John Louth is Deputy Head of Defence, Industries and Society at Royal United Services Institute, and Francis Tusa is Editor of Defence Analysis, a monthly defence newsletter. Julian Richards, we just look at the overall global military spending and we take a snapshot of that. What is actually happening?
Two things, really. I mean, one is that certainly after the Cold War, defence spending was generally looking to be on a downward curve, but the 9/11 effect and the war on terror and everything that's gone after that has seen certain defence expenditures rising again, certainly in the US. However, the overall trend, certainly as far as Europe's concerned, is very much a downward trend. And that's not just individual countries, but of course the European contribution to NATO overall has declined quite significantly.
Francis Tusa, the US is still spending more. I mean, its defence budget is still increasing in real terms, isn't it?
In real terms, possibly no. Simply because defence inflation, this is a figure debated about, is higher than real inflation. And even before it was announced there were going to be cuts in the US budget looking ahead 5 years was certainly not going to keep up with defence inflation. And this is why actually US planners were starting to panic. They've had 10 years where they just hold out their hand and money pours in. And suddenly, this year, 2011 and 12, the first years where this is just not going to happen.
John Louth, in terms of spending, here in the UK, as I said in the introduction, there was recently a defence review. How does the UK compare still overall in terms of its defence spend compared to other countries?
Well, we're still talking about very large numbers here. In dollars, the UK tends to have a budget of about 59 to 61 billion per annum. Now, that will shrink in real terms between now and 2015, and then will increase just slightly above inflation out to 2020. But I think within the UK there is a realisation that the sort of full spectrum responses to threats and risks won't be something that the UK does from 2020 onwards. It will, if you like, come to the marketplace with a whole number of partners in play, both with other nations and with various companies. I think whilst I accept that in real terms the US spend will shrink certainly over the next few years, it's still $715 billion per annum. They're huge numbers. In Russia, we're probably talking about $60 billion per annum. And in China, anything up to $90 billion per annum. So they're very large numbers.
I think the one about the US budget is, of course, they've still got $150 to $180 billion of supplementals to fight wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And although there are weird debates going on about these, that although the money is earmarked for Afghanistan, will they be able to still get money earmarked for Afghanistan even when they're not in Afghanistan? This is almost theology. But if you take out that 150 to 200 billion, so finally it goes from 700 to 500, which would be a pretty substantial cut. I think one of the problems is the way the US spends their money is so bad, it is so chaotic, they actually get, remarkably speaking, less bang from their buck than if they had a slightly smaller budget and spent it better.
Francis Tusa, you said there that the US spends its money badly. The Russians also spend their military money arguably quite badly. I mean, truly staggering levels of corruption, endemic at every level of the system. You, I understand, have a slightly more sceptical view about the impact of this $628 billion program in Russia.
It's a lot of money, straight off, yes. But if you were to come back to Julian's point about the US budget in defence terms of about $60 billion a year, well, $680 billion over 10 years is sort of the same thing as the US budget and a little bit every year. That's not to say it's nothing, and I think we should also bear in mind there are almost certainly extra pots of money sprinkled around the federal departments which go on defence. It's not, say, as impressive as the figures we're getting out of China, seeing their defence budget doubling in 3 years and possibly doubling in the 4 years after that. That's the type of figure that gets any defence planner, especially one, should we say, in the Pentagon, who might have to consider very seriously what this means for the US military in the future. That's the type of figures that gets you going,
Definitely come on to talking more about China in a minute, but Julian Richards, on this question of Russia and what they've announced, where they're spending the money, it does seem that they're still spending it on quite traditional hardware, ships, tanks, missiles, etc. What can we infer from that?
Well, yes, it is quite curious because certainly in the Western world, we're seeing a shift of expenditure towards different types of capabilities. So away from the traditional heavy metal Cold War types of capabilities, more towards more expeditionary, flexible forces, smaller things, less sophisticated things. And that's partly because of our experience in insurgencies and situations like Iraq and Afghanistan, which it is assumed we will be. That's the nature of conflict that we'll be facing. I think in Russia's case, there's partly a sense of needing to renew and adapt as well. So, I mean, a lot of their military equipment will be very, very ageing. So there's an extra dimension there of whether a lot of that expenditure is actually just bringing them up to the standards of other countries.
John Louth, you said something to me interesting, which was, are they essentially just gearing up to fight yesterday's war? Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I think there's a broad point here. When countries spend on military equipment, they do it for two reasons generally. They either do it because they think they're going to need that equipment. Sounds quite basic, but a truism nonetheless. But they also spend money on equipment and capabilities generally to be perceived as powerful. And it's the sort of thing that a powerful country needs to do. And I think when you consider Russian decision-making, you just wonder, perhaps, whether they're pursuing a set of policies because it's a conventional thing for a, in inverted commas, powerful country to do. And it's very easy to buy capability for yesterday's scenario. You know what happened a few years ago. You can manage your defence spend accordingly to meet those threats and risks which are properly understood. What it doesn't do necessarily is allow a country to gear up to the uncertainties that tomorrow may bring.
Francis?
There's one problem I see, which is a lot of these issues about today's wars, tomorrow's wars, get discussed in the Western world in purely Western terms. And because, let's just take, and I know other nations are involved, other nations are available, the United States and Britain being in Afghanistan, the entire defence debate, and Iraq before that, is based around these experiences. And so you have had in Britain people saying, we will never fight a war that isn't like Afghanistan, which is, and that's from an incredibly senior general, which is just such a stupid comment. Because you can go back to the 1990s, and if you had presented to Staff College a scenario to war game where we would have to deploy substantial forces into Afghanistan and sustain them there for 8 years, you would have been laughed out of court. The real problem is, what happens if our potential foes in wherever the next conflict is, we could debate that ad infinitum, actually want to fight a different war to the one we say we think we'll fight. That's when you end up potentially developing hollow forces which lose.
Julian Richards, I'm just following on from Francis's point. Is state versus state warfare still something which, in terms of defence planning, is very much alive? I mean, we've talked about Russia. The Chinese, if we look at what they're spending their money on, they're developing a blue water navy, they're beefing up their cyber warfare capabilities, they're developing stealth technologies and so on. I mean, these are pieces of equipment and technologies that are used in conventional state versus state warfare.
Yes, and it's a very important point that Francis makes, and it's been quite a virulent debate within the armed forces in the UK. That there has been a sense of the normal thinking is that state-on-state conflict is now very unlikely. Those are the sorts of conflicts of the past. We don't need to worry about those sorts of things anymore. But of course, the UK's own national security strategy talks about an age of uncertainty. And there's very much a sense that you just don't know what's around the corner. I mean, if we go back just over a year before the Arab Spring, nobody could have predicted that the events that were going to unfold. Nobody could have said we were going to be involved in an air campaign over Libya. So,
which was states on state.
Absolutely. So there is of course, that makes it extraordinarily difficult because you can't. It's very expensive and very complicated to be prepared for every single type of conflict and to have very expensive capabilities effectively mothballed just in case something happens. So this isn't easy. This is a very difficult thing for governments to tackle.
And how does Iran fit into all of this? I mean, is it a kind of elephant in the room that everyone knows is there but no one wants to talk about, or is it not that significant in terms of longer-term planning?
No, I think it is potentially very significant, and it's the classic large-scale state-on-state potential conflict that's lurking round the corner, possibly. And we certainly shouldn't write that out of the thinking.
And talking about Iran also leads on to this question of cyber warfare. I mean, some people would say a military campaign against the Iranians has in essence already begun. I mean, there was the Stuxnet virus, for example, which was widely thought of as targeting Iran's nuclear program and so on. But on the question of cyber warfare more generally, I mean, the UK has announced that it's beefing up its cyber warfare capabilities. The US and others are investing in it as well. John Louth, is cyber warfare something which is essentially going to become as commonplace as more conventional forms of warfare?
Cyber threats are very complicated and difficult to properly understand beyond the headline of there is a cyber threat. Now, budgets within the UK and the US are being earmarked both for some kind of offensive capability that we don't talk about that a great deal, and protective defensive capabilities. The interesting thing with cyber is that it isn't just state on state. There are huge commercial dimensions to cyber threats and cyber attacks. I think for the first time in a kind of postmodern sense, if you like, we're going to really get to grips with state and industry being in the same conflict space, when we start talking about cyber. And I don't think that we've all properly thought that through yet. Who has the monopoly on cyber force? Is it governments or will it be industrial players?
Just a reminder, you're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig, and today I'm discussing trends in global defence spending with my guests, Julian Richards, John Louth and Francis Tusa. One thing in reading about cyber warfare that I thought was really interesting was the fact that both the UK and the US, in essence, have said that they are increasingly regarding cyber warfare as essentially equivalent to more conventional forms of warfare. And the Pentagon said that they reserve the right to respond with conventional forces to cyber attacks. I mean, is that something in terms of a trend? Is that the shape of things to come, Julian Richards?
Yes, and you could, if one was being cynical about this, you could say this is the military and defence positioning themselves in the cyber realm. Because, of course, that's that statement, you're absolutely right. The US have been urging NATO to make cyber attacks equivalent to conventional military attacks in terms of invoking Article 5 and so on. But, of course, these are completely different scenarios. Who are you going to attack? I mean, one of the things about cyber attacks is that they're very difficult to attribute to anywhere in particular. And what do you do in response? So I think there's as John said, there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done on this. This is a much more complex, much more difficult situation than anything we've